Welcome to the Citizen Media Expert Interview Series. Ashoka Changemakers, with the support of Google, launched Citizen Media, a global innovation competition to find solutions that use media to catalyze participatory citizenship. In this series, we'll connect with media experts from around the world to explore major trends, obstacles, and what lies ahead. Joining us today, we have Mr. Sanjana Hattotuwa, founder of Ground Views, an online citizen media platform supporting social justice efforts. Sanjana is also one of our judges for the Google-supported citizen media competition. Sanjana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Tell me a bit about yourself and your current work. What is on your plate at the moment, and how does it relate to citizen media?
I started a site called Ground Views in around late 2006, and I have been curating it over the past couple of years. In late 2009, I was joined in my efforts with a co-editor. We've gone through some difficult times in the country in which Ground Views is located, which is my home country, the country to which I was born into, Sri Lanka. We didn't know at the time of the launch, but it turned out to be a fairly tumultuous time in the political and social history of the country, where we went through an extremely violent period. Having said that, in May 2009, we also saw an end to a 30-year-old war. So there are no outright hostilities at the moment, but there are very serious questions that endure about just exactly how that war ended. And these are issues and questions that we continue to ask on the platform. The platform itself is very straightforward, really. Publishers content in text, audio, video form, as well as photography, using a range of narrative styles on issues, questions, aspects, facets of life in the country that mainstream media will not or cannot publish or produce. So in that sense, it's almost outlet for people to tell their stories that would otherwise go unheard, and to put issues on the map for discussion in the country as well as internationally. In that respect, we get a lot of people coming into the site to discuss and debate the content that's posted up. We had the country's first presence on Facebook as a Facebook fan page. We also started one of the country's first Twitter feeds. We have 2 curated feeds of other Twitter users as well, in addition to our own, which is followed by about 1,500. And on Facebook, we see a weekly growth of about 100 fans, and we have right now, I think, about 10,680 odd fans, which is quite large for an initiative which doesn't have any commercial backing. So we've been interested ourselves in the growth of our content, particularly because it is critical of those in power and seeks to hold them accountable for their actions. My plate at the moment is quite full, as you can imagine, dealing with these issues, curating them, moderating the discussions, making sure that they are according to our moderation guidelines, which, for example, eschew hate speech and violent diatribes in favor of more progressive dialogue, even if we agree to disagree. We also do quite a lot of new media experiments. We like to really push the boundaries of what's possible using new forms of storytelling, merging photography and audio, for example, or new narrative forms, ways of writing, from satire to the straight-up long reads type essay that we put up online, which is simply not possible given the mainstream media, given the market economics that underpin it. So we have a really diverse range of content style. We have right now, I think, about upwards of 400 contributors who contribute to the site, all of them citizens, most of them at least, with no formal background in journalism. And our readership extends to both the readers within the country. I think on average, we get about 60% of the readers from within the country, as well as increasingly now from the diaspora as well, who are looking at the country post-war with greater interest than they did during the years of war, with a view to engaging, and for some also with a view of returning back to the country to do whatever. So that's basically what I'm doing at the moment, in addition to teaching, which I love. I teach at the Sri Lanka College of Journalism, and I teach new media strategy and digital literacy, which I think are skills that are vital for Sri Lanka's youth and indeed a global population to kind of grasp as we move forward in the 21st century.
You've dedicated your life, particularly professionally, to creating safe spaces for journalists in Sri Lanka to tell compelling stories and call attention to human rights violations. How have people responded to these efforts, and that's both on the positive and the negative sides?
Well, it depends on the audience, it depends on the time and the person, I would imagine. So it's difficult to give a straight-up answer to that. Obviously, you have the people who are appreciative of the fact that there is a safe space, or there are safe spaces, quote-unquote. I suppose it's a question of safer places, and Ground Views and the other digital media initiatives that I've had a hand in producing or putting up on the web have encouraged open discussion on some really tough issues. These are really emotional issues. They are divided camps, often violently so. Post-war, the discussions around, for example, human rights abuses, war crimes, accountability issues, they are tough to not just put up but also to curate, because people come with emotional baggage and it's tough to unpack what you believe to be is true. That goes for us as well, that goes for me as well, in addition to the people who seek to engage. We find it sometimes very difficult to moderate the comments that we get because of the nature of the issues involved. Having said that, people are appreciative. They do like the space that is there for engagement, because there is so little of it in this country. And the negative comments and, of course, feedback we get often comes from people who don't want to see this kind of open discussion. Let me just say that in terms of my own writing, I certainly have a viewpoint and I have an anchor, a certain worldview that I espouse. But on ground views, we seek to create a site where there is no one capital T truth, but we hope that through engagement there is a better truth that's possible, a better perspective for everybody concerned that's possible. And that's what we seek to engage, not to give primacy to one worldview, but to suggest that in a democracy that there are many worldviews, and that the coexistence of these worldviews in competition, but non-violently, is actually what creates a vibrant democracy. Unfortunately, we don't see the timber of democracy in this country, and so our efforts to create those safe spaces through debate, lively debate and discussion, are sometimes taken to very unkindly by people who would rather have ignorance and a general population that doesn't seek to question or hold accountable those in power. So the discussion itself is powerful. It's also its own power to have those discussions. And in addition to that, of course, the issues that those discussions bring up are also very powerful to have. So the response depends very much on whether you want to have open discussion or not. And I don't need to name the parties. Of course, this is a global phenomenon as well. I mean, you take Assange, you take any other country, and there are those in favor of democratic debate, and there are those who seek to have ignorance in place of it. I fall fairly squarely in the camp of those who want to have the debate, but understand on some occasions why there would be people who don't want to have that debate and why ignorance is power.
Now, do you find that those who are typically opposed to having that debate are the citizens and consumers of the information, or are they mostly the parties whom have the least to benefit from the conversation?
Both, I would imagine. I mean, we are a deeply divided society, and I think what happens in protracted conflict is that you grow up with ignorance, but you don't know it as such. And so what you find, for example, in a country such as ours, is a very high literacy. Lots of people can read and write. We have upwards, I think, of 95% literacy, which is one of the highest in the region in South Asia, and quite high, even compares very favorably with statistics around the rest of the world. What we don't have, however, and what is sorely lacking, is media literacy. People believe uncritically what they consume. And this can be very dangerous. We have seen the effects of Radio Milcolin, for example, in Rwanda, and its contribution to the atrocities on a mass scale that happened there with the genocide. Of course, in Sri Lanka, the situation isn't as bleak, but unfortunately, we don't have people who can critically question even the media that they agree with. And so what you have is propaganda often parading as news and believed to be true and factual. And that is extremely dangerous, because if you have a citizenry and if you have a general population that cannot understand what they consume, you then have politicians who take advantage of the fact and use propaganda to manipulate public opinion in support of their parochialism. And that can be extremely dangerous, particularly also because it's those very same policies that led to a 30-year-old war in the first instance, and we certainly don't want to revisit that. So the animosity, the opposition to the content that we put up comes both from those sections in government, not all, but also from citizens who sometimes feel that we shouldn't be asking and debating and raising and flagging the issues that we put up because we are post-war now and these are moot issues. These are not issues that we really should be talking about. We should be talking about other issues like, I don't know, development and tourism, for example. But these are issues also that we are interested in. But we're also interested in the deeper systemic issues that continue to persist and to bedevil our democratic progress. So the opposition comes both from citizens who do not understand that it is important to have these debates, as well as, obviously, sections of government who find these issues and these debates, to quote Al Gore's book, inconvenient truths.
Very interesting. Do you find that there are any technologies in particular that you think have a greater potential for impact than others?
Well, it depends very much again on context and what you seek to communicate and with whom. And without that in mind, it is almost impossible to answer that question. We use a spectrum of technologies ranging from the web, the blogging platform, where Ground Views is based on WordPress, to one of the first sites in Sri Lanka to be mobile friendly, so you actually can engage with the content on any mobile phone, not just a smartphone. We also use, as I said earlier, Facebook and Twitter, and even on the web we use a range of means. We use photography, we use podcasts, audio podcasts, we use video, so that always try to engage with two things. One, new audiences, new readership. Our readership is basically from 18 to 34, as Facebook tells us, and that age group is a telegenic phase, is a group with they have a short attention span, so we keep that in mind as well. But we also try to buck the trend. We introduced a section called Long Reads earlier this year, which is the long form essay type articles, more reflective, more in depth. They ruminate, they have a better writing style. You have the space with about 7,000-8,000 words to really go into the number of issue. So we have a range of styles, and we use a range of technology platforms to reach out to and engage different age groups and different readerships.
What I mean by the technologies having a potential for impact is when you look at internet versus mobile, or mobile versus radio, or even the types of newer architectures and emerging communication technologies, are there any of them that seem to be more useful than others in connecting in your particular context? So in Sri Lanka, for example.
Well, the mobile phone, I think, is globally the phenomenon that's year on year showing a growth that's mind-boggling. ITU would have that in our lifetimes for the first time in human history. We are going into what I call an addressable humanity, where man, woman or child, IDP or citizen of New York, you're going to have a mobile number either in your own name or within walking distance, and we've never had that in human history before. And this single fact makes every one of us potentially almost, anywhere in the world you are, both an information producer but also a consumer on an individual basis. So we don't really know what kind of future that has for journalism as we know it today, citizen or mainstream, where anybody, anywhere can produce information but also consume through text messages. That has seen an incredible growth in my own country, both during war and certainly post-war, in areas which were ravaged by war. Now, for example, you have 3G telephony, and they seem to also be leapfrogging the areas that had connectivity. So the areas, for example, that were war ravaged now are getting very good 3G services, wireless 3G services that took years for us in Colombo, for example, to get. So they are completely leapfrogging, in a sense, wired broadband connectivity and then going to wireless, which is great because that then encourages people on the ground to create their own content in time, and for also them to consume content that has been produced for them by their own identity groups in the country, but also from the diaspora. So it just creates this very rich pot, melting pot almost, of producers and consumers. So the mobile phone is really powering this. But also, let me also add that one of the really interesting things we've seen in the country post-war in particular has been the growth of local language blogging. A couple of years ago, this was limited to an urban elite who produced and consumed content in English. Now, you see the burgeoning of local language content, which is absolutely fantastic. In my country, it's Sinhala and Tamil. Sinhala is only spoken in Sri Lanka. Tamil, as you know, is spoken in many parts of India, plus also by a much larger diaspora worldwide. So Sinhala has had technical problems. We have problems in rendering the font and typing it in, but these are slowly but surely being addressed, and it's really nice to see that content blossoming as well. And one of the things I helped start about 3-4 years ago is the Sinhala equivalent of Ground Views called vikalpa.org. You won't be able to read it because you won't have the font to understand the language, but there is a growing readership of that site and the YouTube videos that we produce in Sinhala who also engage in Sinhala. So it's really fantastic to see that kind of growth as well. And that's happening on the web. That's also happening on the mobile phone as well. On the mobile phone, let me just end by saying that it's also very interesting because although the Sinhala fonts have been developed for the mobile phone, very few use it. They use instead a Romanic Sinhala. They type Sinhala in English, and that's how they communicate. Even though there are, for the Nokia phones, for example, that you buy in Sri Lanka, the Sinhala fonts built in. So, I mean, you're seeing new emergent ways of people using both their own language plus also English and PCs as well as mobile phones to kind of both produce content and also engage with it. And I think it's really, really rich texture for civic media and citizen journalism initiatives to take root, grow, and be part of my country's post for democratic potential.
Very interesting things to consider here, particularly the local language blogging and this seeming blend between the use of the Roman language characters and the local language as well. It will be really fascinating to see how that grows. So moving forward a little bit with the conversation about how this functions on the local level, what are some of the more daunting or even common challenges that citizen journalists face in your context in Sri Lanka?
When it's digital media literacy, people know about Facebook and Twitter and use it for purposes of personal communication. I had coffee here, my dog died, my cat, is with a knitting ball, or I just broke up with my girlfriend kind of thing, which is great. What we seek to encourage is the more serious discussion, the more serious engagement with polity and society as a citizen. As a country, we have voters, but we have a very embryonic notion of citizenship because we are so fearful of engaging with government for fear of what that would entail to self, family, and loved ones. We are still, unfortunately, a very violent society, and democratic dialogue often has very real life physical consequences for those who ask inconvenient questions. So that fear, that anxiety, that fright, a combination of all those three keeps people away from having the discussions and debates we would like to see far more of on social media, web media platforms, even though their growth is phenomenally, and it's absolutely mind-blowing and staggering year on year. Most of it is not for political discussions. So that's a fundamental problem that we have across all media. When it comes to the web, it's still an issue of connectivity. Our connectivity is really quite good, and it's getting better year on year. So I think that in the next 5 years or so, wherever you are in the country, you're going to have internet access and broadband at that. It's just a matter of then creating the digital media literacy, which again is across media, to help citizens create their own media that's meaningful to their own community. So they don't have, for example, Colombo telling a district or a province miles or hours away what they should be consuming. I see no need for that at all. Sometimes in the US called hyperlocal media, I think that's also hyped too much. I think it's a healthy interaction between the two that I can stand the most. I mean, the people on the ground can benefit the most from content that they produce and they are interested in from their local vicinity and locality and neighborhood and province and district, coupled with the broader national perspective and the international perspective that larger media houses can bring. So I don't see it as an either-or proposition. I think that civic media can and should coexist with mainstream media, and the both can benefit from the growing ubiquity of web-based platforms that aid the dissemination and production of content for both, as well as I said earlier, the ubiquity now of mobile devices in the country. There are challenges still remaining with local language production. For example, as I said earlier, Sinhala is a language only spoken in Sri Lanka, so we still have some issues about producing the script on a web browser or on the computer, but these are also technical problems that are slowly being addressed. Perhaps may I end by being slightly politic. One of the underlying problems we have in this country is twofold. One is that we have a very limited awareness about open source technologies and stuff like Ubuntu, which can be as helpful as, say, Microsoft Windows in many instances, also because it has better language support out of the box. The problem with a lot of proprietary software, a lot of licensed software, is precisely that they are licensed. To give that in perspective, a Microsoft Windows 7 plus Office license in Sri Lankan rupees would be more than the price of a brand new computer. So if you're buying a brand new computer, you have to spend the same amount, if not more, to get your licensed software, and that's not a viable proposition. That leads to software piracy. And even though the police and the government and the large software corporations are clamping down on piracy, you really don't have a choice as a consumer, much as you would like to respect the law, to economically purchase that licensed software. So I think that the awareness about open source technologies and open source tools and open source operating systems is vital for any country to kind of encourage their citizens to be mindful of the law and yet reach their kind of digital media potential. So it's not just one way that they can go. There are also lots of free tools out there. I think that awareness about those free tools also needs to grow in any country, particularly in my own, if we are keen to see citizens producing more and more content.
What do you think it will take to really propel the field of citizen media forward? I know this is a sort of a large question, but is there anything in particular that would be really helpful to citizen journalists? Anything that's missing to facilitate that storytelling process?
I think it's the storytelling. I think it's the storytelling itself. I think there is this conception, this notion that citizen media is one thing or the other, but I think it's a wonderful, rich, diverse spectrum of how you tell a story. Now, that story can be a single photo with a powerful caption. That story can be an audio podcast of an illiterate person who has a story to say, who has borne witness to something very interesting that nobody else has or has a unique perspective on it. That story can be a series of photo essays done by a professional, narrated by somebody on the ground. That story can be an HD video or a camera phone video. That story can be written as an essay or as a poem or as a satirical piece. I think the rich spectrum, the diversity of storytelling, of which we have a very rich Asian tradition and indeed a global tradition, I think needs to be reflected in the technology. Very often we speak about technologies first and storytelling second. I choose the other way around. I seek to first understand what is the story we want to tell. That can be a hard story, that can be a human rights violation, that can be allegations of the most horrific acts of war imaginable. And it can also be a good story. It can be the government official who refuses to take a bribe. It can be the teacher who comes to school on time and stays after school every single day, unappreciated, with no salary increase for a quarter century. It can be the bus conductor who actually gives a ticket instead of just pocketing the money that gives rise to corruption. It can be the public official who stood up against corruption and got acid thrown in his face. So it's not just about opposition to government, it's also about celebrating that which in government works despite all odds, and figuring out with our rich tradition of storytelling how you can communicate this to a broader audience with the technologies that we as a generation have today that our former generations didn't even a couple of years ago. I think if you start there, the technology becomes less of the issue, and then the problem then becomes what stories do you actually curate and how do you tell them. I think to get this into the minds of people is the toughest challenge I've faced as a teacher. It's in a sense opening up their imagination. It's opening their eyes, making them realize that they do have stories to tell. And it's about how you tell the stories, not so much how you produce them and put them up on the web that's most important. And I think that's the greatest challenge, because what war does to many people, including myself, I suppose, to a great degree, is that it makes us fearful of telling stories. Our stories are Hansel and Gretel and Alice in Wonderland. We have rich stories of our own. There are stories of my own cultural heritage that I grew up with that are no longer told. They're no longer transported into a digital medium. But there are also the other stories of bombs in the night and white vans that have come and taken and broken families away. There are plenty of stories around. No country, no region, no peoples, no culture is devoid of stories. I think we have a civic media, for me, is about the potential to get those stories out to a wider audience, A, and B, to capture those stories for posterity. Please note that I'm not asking necessarily for what many in the global media call for as regime change. I think that's a facile notion, that stories published can lead to the overthrow of governments. I think it can in some instances, but it's very, very rare. I am more interested in stories for their own value and their own worth, not just for us, but for future generations, so that we have a richer history. And when we have a richer history, my working assumption is that we have a richer citizenry, and that can only benefit democracy.
Beautifully stated, and so much to think about. Sanjana, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, and we are so excited to have Ground Views and yourself on board for this competition, and really look forward to seeing the amazing things that come out of it. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.